Like many folks, I am currently working on a list of my top 10 films of the past decade. I began compiling it fairly certain of its contents, either in official recognition or as an honorable mention, is largely a matter of figuring out how to put them together and what I want to say about each. But last week, I deleted an already written entry about Edgar Wright's 2010 film Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. You see, up until last Tuesday, I have been gleefully declaring that Scott Pilgrim is the best video game movie of all time, in contrast to the best video game adaptation, which is Takashi Miike's Ace Attorney. Even though it's based on a comic, in film form it really plays out so game-like. No more heroes but T for teen, and I love it. And it deserves recognition for that. But thanks to a mid-afternoon showing of a little-known 2002 Korean action film at Lincoln Center, I know the truth now. It's not the best. And it never was. Hello, by the way, and welcome to the Week I Review. You can call me shook to the core. And today, I am talking about Resurrection of the Little Match Girl. I imagine we're not terribly far off from an era where movies feature professional video game players in key roles or see their line of work as serious, but I cannot think of a single time I have seen it yet. When you imagine someone bragging about how great they are at StarCraft, followed by a scene where two women fight over who gets to have sex with the really cool guy who's great at StarCraft, it's some kind of fantasy, typically followed by a cut to that person drooling on a pillow and probably their mother throwing a pillow at them in frustration because they haven't left their basement in 11 days. Certainly, the next scene we see that person in wouldn't feature them winning a tournament and actually getting the prize and the girls, right? I mean, if that was somehow in a movie, it sounds like it would be pretty gross and not really something I would want to see. And yet, here it was in 2002 happening to a peripheral character, no less. And sure, South Korea and StarCraft have a history, but it's strange to see such a thing on the big screen, especially considering its writer-director, Jang Sun-woo, was nearly 50 years old at the time. Seemingly Jang's final film, Resurrection of the Little Match Girl, tells the story of a digital interactive experience made real for a small group of people selected by their mutual decision to purchase a lighter. Calling the number inscribed on its side gives them the chance to jack into the Matrix. If they assent, the game begins. It is inspired, oddly enough, by Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Match Girl, an 1845 story about a young girl who, unable to sell any matches and afraid of her abusive father's punishment, freezes to death in the street on New Year's Eve. But though the circumstances are sad, she dies happy. The hypothermia gives her beautiful visions of warmth and food and her grandmother, with whom she believes she is going in her last moments alive. The movie takes the basic premise, girl fails to sell a portable fire source and contentedly dies in the cold, and updates it slightly. Most notably, though she is still called the Little Match Girl, she sells lighters. And instead of an abusive father, she has to contend with the men who will only buy her lighters if they can have her as well. Eventually, a garbage man, which is to say a man who collects garbage, but also clearly a garbage person, tells her to just give up and huff the lighter fluid, which she does. One after another, she inhales their gas and goes into a blissful trance before she too freezes to death. We see this play out in heavily stylized fashion in the film's opening minutes. At the time, we have absolutely no idea what we're in for or what the hell this has to do with anything, so when it cuts from a girl dying to folks eating and talking about StarCraft, it's a pretty jarring transition, and it will not be the last one of those. The story that we're shown is the premise of the game that folks get jacked into. You might reasonably assume that the game would involve trying to save the little match girl from this bleak fate, but you would be exactly wrong. In fact, it is about ensuring that these events play out precisely as the story foretells them. The little match girl must die, frozen and alone. But the beautiful images that the lighter fluid gives her in her last moments will be of the one she loves. And whomever that is at the time of her death is the winner. Yep, that's right. This is a game about manipulating an innocent little girl into falling in love with you while violently dispatching anyone else trying to do the same. So now you're probably thinking, what the actual fuck, Alec? This sounds horrible, and also I want to see it very badly. Well, I've got some good and bad news. The good news is that how things play out is more interesting and even stranger than you expect. But unfortunately, you're probably just going to have to trust me on that. DVDs appear to be long out of print, with the only options I found being various Region 2 options from resellers on like eBay and Amazon. I saw a 35mm print at the same Korean New Wave retrospective where I saw Save the Green Planet, The Foul King, and 5 other films that I didn't make videos about over the past few weeks. And I was told by one of the guys who organized the series that getting the rights to screen this film in particular was extremely difficult. So it seems unlikely that it will be more readily available anytime soon, sadly. There are, however, some clips here on YouTube that you can check out, including a trailer that is genuinely bewildering because it includes a lot of these gamey visual effects that just aren't in the movie. There are even a few shots where folks are standing like they're in a fighting game and have health bars above them and whatnot, and those two do fight in the movie, but unless it put me in a temporary fugue state, it doesn't happen like that. And while I wouldn't totally put it past Resurrection of the Little Match Girl to have done that to me, it didn't. I couldn't pull my eyes off that screen for one gosh damn moment. Our primary player is not the professional I mentioned earlier, though he is taking part as well. Rather, it is his loser friend, Ju. Ju buys the lighter, calls the number, and joins the game as a level 1 weakling with no in-game currency or weapons or anything of the sort. You know, a noob. But while he has just joined, other folks have been in it for who knows how long. There are lone wolves seeking the little match girl's love, as well as entire organizations that have been built up around this, and we will be introduced to them via character sheets and variably problematic one-liners. And so at first, Ju must stand back and watch the higher level players have all the fun. And oh, what fun it is. If I didn't know what the Korean language looked or sounded like, I might have just assumed that this movie was from Hong Kong, because it really has that feel. In a very good way. The action is showy and bombastic with wire work and big explosions and so much gunfire. There are some Hong Kong type names in the credits, so I'm going to assume that the action team did in fact come from there, which would explain a whole lot. What it really feels like, though, is a 90s Hong Kong action movie with a dramatic Korean frame grafted onto it. The Hong Kong version of the film would start like 20 minutes later and end 5 minutes earlier. It would just be the game. But although that would arguably make for a better movie, it would lose some of what makes it such a good video game movie. You know, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is like a beautiful vision of how games should be, with a narrative that is cohesive and complete. Resurrection of the Little Match Girl is messy and opaque, much like a real video game story, especially like a Japanese action game story. Eventually, Ju powers up, in part thanks to the fish soup seller who is also the game's primary weapons dealer, and he finds the little match girl dying in the cold. We literally see her hit points dropping with each breath she takes. She says his name, but is not actually thinking of him. It's another Ju in her heart, a singer, and we get to hear him sing. But even though this Ju thinks he may be about to win, he doesn't let the little match girl die. At the behest of the game's developer, who is also stuck in the game, he takes her somewhere warm. They go to sleep. She wakes up first, she takes his gun, she goes back out selling lighters. But the little match girl's packing a different kind of heat now, so when people rebuff her requests, she lights them up. In the introduction, she sat in a parking space and a car honked at her and she ran away. Here, she gets honked at and lets loose a spray of bullets into the windshield. She is done being used and abused by the system that created her. But though she goes on quite the rampage, eventually she runs out of bullets, and it must come to an end. The system takes her for reprogramming, and Ju must save her. And that's when things start to get weird. Now, the film commits to its vision of the Matrix, and it calls it that, which is something like what you'd get if you took the plot of the original film and ran it through Google Translate a few dozen times. Instead of a spoon that doesn't exist, there are several days of meditative fishing without bait, which is beautifully reminiscent of those bizarre side quest minigames that totally wreck the flow of the story because you have to spend so much time on them. But if you win, you get a weapon that just changes everything. And Ju does. It looks like a toy, but it is the most powerful thing in the game, blowing up turrets and straight up disintegrating people with nothing more than a thought. And because he is the one, only he can use it. When someone else takes it and tries to fire, it turns into a fish again and swims through the air back into Ju's hand. The film eventually becomes fairly reliant on very bad CGI, but it works in the context of this absolute nonsense, because this is a video game from 2002, and also it's funny. An obscenely slow-moving homing missile, the disintegrations from the fish gun, a helicopter in an endless hallway that just clips through walls because game bosses aren't subject to the same rules that players are. The subpar green screening when Ju comes face to face with the big baddie, a white man who speaks heavily accented English that they unfortunately didn't subtitle, so I'm honestly not entirely clear what he was talking about, but I'm sure it was generic technobabble villain stuff. What follows isn't even worth trying to describe, but I'll bullet point the main bits and you can let your imagination run wild, content in the knowledge that the reality is almost assuredly stranger still. There are multiple endings, it turns out, one of which just cuts the whole thing off and sends Ju back to the real world, which opens up so many logical cans of worms, while the other features tears of love that bring people back to their senses, running on water, a glowing butterfly whose death shatters the entire universe, and a final cutscene of sorts that somehow makes even less sense when paired with its voiceover explanation. It is fucking wild. But it has to be, because it is a film that seeks to emulate the real experience of a video game on the big screen, and it pulls off the magic trick of doing that without making you wish that you were playing it. A huge problem with video game movies is just that. They remind you of video games, but have taken away the thing that makes you like video games. The game part. But when you have something as dense and fast-paced as Resurrection of the Little Match Girl, you don't have time to want to take over the controls. You're too busy just trying to get your bearings before ultimately giving into the experience. I feel genuinely fortunate to have been able to see this movie and see it on the big screen on an appropriately rough 35mm print and in 2019. It is such a product of a time and place, and it captures an experience that so many of us have had sitting in our living rooms, controllers in hand, jaw dropped at the sheer nonsense on the screen before us, but giddy to be part of it all the same. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you particularly to my patrons, my mom, Hamrain Marco, Kat Saracata, Benjamin Schiff, Anthony Cole, @BlasianFMA, Magnolia Denton, and Elliot Fowler. If you like this video, that's great. If not, I'm sorry. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe. I hope to see you next week.